I want you to take a moment and just, look at the physical objects in your immediate vicinity right now.
Like literally whatever is on your desk.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it is the smartphone you are holding, the laptop resting on your desk, or even those wireless headphones you might be wearing.
Right.
If you were to turn those devices over and read the fine print, you would almost certainly find a variation of a very specific, very modern phrase.
Oh, I know exactly the one you mean.
It usually reads something like designed in California, or London, or Tokyo, followed immediately by assembled in China, or Vietnam, or Mexico.
Right.
We see this geographic split so frequently that we barely even register it as unusual anymore. But if you stop and really think about it, this is not just some random quirk of the tech industry.
No, not at all.
This deliberate, calculated geographic separation between the conception of an idea and the physical manifestation of that idea that is basically the defining feature of the modern global economy.
It absolutely is. And it represents a profound, just a fundamental shift in how human beings organize themselves to create value.
How so?
Well, for centuries, our foundational understanding of global trade was based on a very physical, straightforward, almost tangible exchange.
Like trading physical goods.
Exactly. If you go back to the classic economic texts like David Ricardo in the early 19th century, the examples were always things like England trading its locally produced cloth for Portugal's locally produced wine.
Right. You make something, I make something, we swap.
You manufacture a physical good strictly within your borders. I manufacture a different physical good strictly within my borders. We load them onto ships and we trade. The intellectual creation and the physical production were inextricably linked.
They happen in the exact same zip code.
In the exact same place. But today, we have moved so aggressively beyond that traditional model. We have firmly entered the era of what economists call multinational production, or MP.
Okay, multinational production.
In this MP era, the intellectual property, the blueprint, the software architecture, the actual design is generated in one country. The actual physical product is then manufactured in a completely different country.
And then sold somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. And finally, that finished good is shipped and sold to consumers in a third country. The thought and the thing have been completely systematically separated.
That separation is incredibly massive. And unpacking the hidden logic behind it is the core mission of today's deep dive into the source material.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
We are going to take a really comprehensive, incredibly detailed look at a groundbreaking study authored by economists Kostas Arkalakis, Natalia Raimondo, Andres Rodriguez-Clare, and Stephen Eppel.
A very heavy-hitting team.
The research paper is titled Innovation and Production in the Global Economy. And what makes this paper so fascinating to me is that it does not just observe this separation.
Right, they actually build a mathematical engine to explain it.
Yes, we are going to explore the underlying forces that dictate why certain countries inevitably evolve into these massive idea factories, while others are seemingly designated as the world's manufacturing hubs.
Which is the billion-dollar question.
And more importantly for you listening, we're going to look at what this geographic lottery actually means for the standard of living of the workers residing in both places.
Because what makes this specific piece of research so vital is that the authors built what is known in the field as a quantifiable general equilibrium model.
Which sounds incredibly dense.
It does sound dense, but what it essentially means is that they are not just philosophizing or throwing out interesting theories in a vacuum.
They are using real numbers.
Exactly. They built a mathematical framework and then plugged in a massive, comprehensive data set spanning 26 different countries to see if their theory actually holds up against reality.
They're trying to trace the invisible economic gravity.
The gravity that actively pulls innovation to one side of the globe and physical production to the other.
So if you look at the labels on your devices and wonder about the journey those products took, this is for you.
Absolutely.
Whether you are actively navigating global supply chains for your career, or you are simply trying to understand the macroeconomic forces that dictate job security and the cost of living in your own community, this deep dive is going to challenge a lot of preconceived notions.
We are definitely going to dismantle some very entrenched narratives about how globalization actually impacts our daily lives.
But to dismantle those narratives, We first have to establish the baseline reality of the world we are currently operating in, right?
Yes. The authors dedicate the initial portion of their research to laying out the sheer scale of what we might call the great geographical separation.
The divorce of ideas in production.
It is the complete systemic divorce of innovation and production.
And the data dive they perform to illustrate this is genuinely staggering. They zoom in specifically on the United States to highlight the velocity of this shift,
The time frame they use is key here.
right? They look at a very specific 10-year window
Yeah.
between the years 1999 and 2009.
Now, think about that decade for a second.
That captures the aftermath of the dot-com bubble,
The aggressive rise of the modern internet
the entry of China into the World Trade Organization.
and the launch of the first smartphone. It is a massive decade.
Huge. And in that single decade, United States manufacturing research and development, relative to value added, jumped from 8.7% to 12.7%.
That is a massive proportional reallocation of capital.
American companies were pouring increasingly vast sums of money strictly into the thinking, designing, and engineering phases of manufacturing.
And while that intense concentration of cognitive effort and capital was happening domestically, the physical execution of those ideas was migrating overseas at a similar pace.
The actual building of the things.
Over that exact same 10-year period from 1999 to 2009, the share of U.S. multinational employees who were actually working in foreign affiliates jumped from 22% to 31%.
Meaning people employed by American companies, but physically working outside the United States.
Correct. And the concentration within that shift is particularly revealing. Affiliates located in China took a massive, disproportionate slice of that expansion.
How massive?
It eventually accounted for 1 in every 8 foreign employees of United States firms.
1 in 8 foreign employees of an American company operating in a single country. That really paints a picture of how targeted this geographic separation was.
It really does.
And it wasn't just an isolated strategy utilized by a handful of tech giants. This was a fundamental restructuring of the entire corporate landscape.
It was a global phenomenon, and the researchers contextualized this using broader data from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
What does that broader data show?
When you look at the macro-level data across all advanced economies, a very clear, undeniable pattern emerges. The countries that spend the highest percentage of their resources on research and development are almost entirely the motherships or headquarters of multinational corporations.
The innovator.
The innovators. And the visual data here in Figure 1 of the paper is striking. For these highly innovative nations, the sales generated by their overseas affiliates absolutely dwarfed the sales of foreign companies operating within their own domestic borders.
So they were essentially exporting intangible ideas, patents, and operational blueprints.
Exactly. And in return, their foreign manufacturing affiliates are generating massive tangible sales across the globe.
So international specialization is just the new, unavoidable baseline of the global economy.
It is the new normal.
Countries are no longer specializing just in different types of physical goods, like wine versus cloth. They're specializing in entirely different phases of the production cycle.
Some are specializing in cognitive, high-skill design tasks, while others are specializing in physical, high-efficiency assembly tasks.
But as we all see in the news cycle every single day, this reality brings an enormous amount of societal anxiety with it.
That anxiety is a crucial component of the global landscape, and the research paper carefully identifies the core fears surrounding this geographic separation.
If you look at the political discourse right now, you see two massive competing anxieties depending entirely on which side of this cognitive physical divide a country sits.
And it is really important to note that the paper categorizes these perspectives not to endorse them, but to acknowledge the real-world tensions driving policy decisions.
Right. It's important we simply lay out what the research observes about the current global debate without taking sides. We are just imparting the source material here.
Exactly.
So the sources highlight two primary fears.
Yeah.
First, you have what we can call the production country fear.
Right.
This is the anxiety felt by nations that find themselves specializing almost entirely in the manufacturing and assembly side of the equation.
Like Mexico or Poland in the model.
Right. Their fear revolves around a concept the researchers refer to as hollowing out their future.
Which is a very visceral term.
The underlying worry is profound.
Hmm.
If our entire economy is optimized to simply build other people's designs, and we fail to develop our own domestic innovation sector, are we fundamentally stunting our long-term economic trajectory?
Are we just functioning as a temporary, low-cost assembly line?
Exactly. An assembly line that will inevitably be abandoned and bypassed the moment a cheaper labor market emerges somewhere else on the globe.
It is a very real existential dread for developing economies.
And then on the absolute flip side of that coin, you have the innovating country fear.
This is the anxiety felt acutely within the borders of the wealthy nations that currently serve as the global idea factories.
Places like the US or the UK.
The fear dominating their domestic discourse is that by systematically outsourcing the actual physical manufacturing process to other countries, you are inevitably decimating the middle-income, blue-collar job market.
The factory jobs.
Yes. The pervasive worry is that you are creating a fundamentally unequal, hollowed-out economy where you only have highly compensated executives, software engineers, and designers at the very top,
And a massive pool of lower-wage service and retail workers at the bottom.
with the traditional, stable middle class completely eradicated.
Those are two incredibly intense fears that essentially dictate the trade policies and political platforms of the modern era. But the expert sources here take a step back from the political rhetoric, right?
They analyze this strictly through a rigorous economic lens.
So how do economists actually explain the fundamental forces driving this massive separation in the first place?
To explain it, economists traditionally fall back on one of the oldest and most foundational concepts in the field, which is comparative advantage.
Okay, comparative advantage.
This is the simple, elegant idea that every participant in an economy should focus exclusively on what they are relatively best at producing.
Because mathematically, that brings greater efficiency and wealth to the entire interconnected system.
Exactly.
No.
If we look at country A, which possesses a massive concentration of capital, advanced universities, and highly educated software engineers, and we compare it to country B,
Which possesses a massive, highly efficient, and less expensive labor force.
the standard theory of comparative advantage dictates that country A should logically focus on designing the complex goods, and country B should logically focus on assembling them.
It is framed as a simple matter of optimizing global efficiency.
That's the textbook answer.
Wait, hold on. If it were just basic comparative advantage, wouldn't we see a much more even spread of innovation among all the wealthy countries?
That is an excellent point.
Because the paper points out a massive plot twist here. Comparative advantage alone, that traditional textbook theory, is actually completely insufficient to explain the extreme hyper-concentration of innovation that we observe in the real world today.
That is precisely the gap the researchers identified. Standard comparative advantage cannot explain why certain cities or specific nations become absolute black holes for research and development.
Like Silicon Valley?
Exactly. To solve this, the authors introduce a concept that fundamentally modifies traditional trade theory. And it is a crucial concept for grasping the reality of modern globalization.
How is it called?
It is called the home market effect, or HME.
The home market effect completely flips our traditional understanding of trade on its head. It turns out the sheer size of a domestic market acts as its own gravitational force.
It does.
I want to dig into this because understanding it unlocks so much of what we see happening around us.
To truly grasp the home market effect, we have to look closely at the unique economic nature of innovation itself.
Okay?
Innovation possesses what economists refer to as increasing returns to scale.
Increasing returns to scale.
Let's contrast it with traditional manufacturing. If you are building a wooden chair, every single new chair you produce requires a new piece of wood, new nails, and new physical labor.
Right, the cost scales linearly with production.
But innovation is entirely different. If you spend $1 billion researching and developing a revolutionary new microchip architecture or writing a groundbreaking operating system, you only have to do the grueling, incredibly expensive work of inventing it once.
The first unit costs $1 billion.
But you can then replicate and sell that exact same digital blueprint or that exact same software code an infinite number of times for virtually zero additional cost.
The fixed upfront costs are astronomical, but the marginal cost of producing the second, third, or millionth unit is basically zero.
Precisely. And here is where the reality of geography comes crashing into the theory. The global economy is not perfectly smooth or frictionless.
There are massive geographical frictions.
Linguistic barriers, legal compliance differences, and simple transportation logistics.
Right.
Because innovation carries these massive sunk upfront costs, but infinite returns to scale, and because it is inherently easier, cheaper, and legally simpler to sell your newly invented product to the people sitting right next to you.
That makes sense.
Innovation tends to be magnetically drawn toward geographic locations that already possess massive built-in end consumer markets.
So a massive domestic consumer base naturally acts like a gravitational black hole. Their sheer economic gravity sucks in the innovation and the corporate headquarters, regardless of whether they have a pure comparative advantage on paper.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where a brilliant team of engineers in a very small country invents a great product.
Yeah.
Because their home market is tiny, it might take them years of navigating international trade laws and shipping logistics to sell enough units abroad just to recoup their massive initial R&D costs.
They'd have to export immediately.
But if that exact same team relocates to a massive economy, they can launch their product and immediately access hundreds of millions of wealthy consumers without ever crossing a single border or dealing with a single foreign tariff.
That's a huge advantage.
The home market effect, combined with the stubborn friction of moving things across international borders, completely warps and distorts the traditional clean map of comparative advantage.
The theory is incredibly elegant, but how do they actually go about proving it? It sounds perfectly logical in a vacuum, but the global economy involves millions of companies making millions of independent decisions every single day.
It is incredibly chaotic in reality.
Right. How do economists capture the gravity of an economic black hole?
They capture it by constructing an incredibly robust, deeply complex theoretical framework. The authors of our source material built their mathematical model on the foundation of a highly influential paper published in 2003.
Widely known in economics as the Militz model.
Yes. Prior to 2003, a lot of trade models treated all companies within a specific sector as basically identical.
Like all car companies are exactly the same.
Exactly. The Militz model revolutionized trade theory by introducing firm heterogeneity.
Firm heterogeneity.
Which is just a formal way of acknowledging the obvious reality that not all companies are the same. Some are highly productive, incredibly efficient juggernauts, while others in the exact same industry are inefficient and barely surviving.
That makes total sense.
But the authors of this new paper took the Militz framework and added a crucial reality-shifting update to it.
They introduced the reality of geographic choice.
Yes. They integrated the reality that modern multinational firms possess the power to choose exactly where on the surface of the earth they want to place their physical factories.
The traditional models generally assumed you built the product where you lived, and your only choice was whether to export it or not.
Right. This new framework acknowledges that it is not just about choosing to export. It is about choosing where to physically manifest the design before you sell it.
Which brings us to the ultimate high-stakes trade-off that every single multinational CEO has to navigate.
It is the daily puzzle for these companies.
Let's walk through the exact choice matrix the model simulates. You manage a company, and your team has just finalized the design for a groundbreaking new product.
Okay.
You want to sell this product to a massive consumer base located in a foreign country. You are faced with two distinct paths.
Path one.
Path one. Do you build your physical factory very close to those foreign consumers? Doing so allows you to bypass expensive ocean shipping, avoid international tariffs, and get the product to market faster.
The economists in the paper label these logistical shipping and trade costs as the friction of distance, or tau in the model.
The friction of distance. Yeah. Okay. Path two is the alternative. Do you bypass proximity to the consumer and instead build the factory in a completely different third location where labor and operational costs are incredibly cheap?
In order to exploit their specific comparative advantage in manufacturing.
Exactly. But if you choose this path, you take on a whole new set of frictions. You have to manage a facility in the foreign jurisdiction, deal with different labor laws, perhaps navigate a language barrier, and manage a massive extended supply chain.
And the economists label these specific hurdles as multinational production costs, or gamma.
Gamma. So it is the eternal daily tug of war for global supply chain managers. The friction of distance versus the friction of foreign operation. Do I pay the shipping costs or do I pay the complexity costs?
And to capture this mathematically, the authors created a concept we can visualize as the global triangle.
The global triangle.
They analyze the three-way geographic interaction for every single product on the market. Point one of the triangle is the origin of the initial idea.
Let's call that location I.
Point two is the physical location where the manufacturing actually takes place.
Location L.
And point three is the final destination where the consumer purchases the good. Location N.
So that three-point framework is the engine of the model. Idea is born in location I, physical product is assembled in location L, and the final sale occurs in location N.
The vital economic pulse of the modern global economy happens through the relentless flow of capital within this specific triangle.
How does the capital flow?
When the consumer buys the product in the destination market, those revenues flow backward through the production site, paying for the labor and materials.
Mhm.
And ultimately, the remaining profits flow all the way back to the origin site. That returning river of profit is what actually pays for the initial research, the software engineers, the marketing team, and the executives who conceived the idea in the first place.
But to make a mathematical model actually predict how companies will behave within that triangle, the researchers had to figure out how to account for a deeply human variable, which is competence.
Competence is notoriously hard to model.
Right. How good is a specific company at actually operating in a country it knows nothing about? The paper utilizes a deeply complex mathematical tool for this, which they call the multivariate Pareto distribution.
A very sophisticated statistical tool.
Now, we are not going to get bogged down in the advanced calculus here, but we absolutely need to understand the underlying logic. How does this specific distribution map corporate competence across borders?
It is a brilliant way to quantify a very abstract concept. We can think of the multivariate Pareto distribution as a tool designed specifically to measure the correlation of a company's inherent efficiency as it crosses international borders.
Okay, let's build out a concrete scenario to illustrate this.
Imagine a highly successful mid-sized company based in Germany that manufactures specialized automotive parts. They have a brilliant executive team, a deeply ingrained culture of precision, and a highly efficient, custom-built manufacturing process at their home facility in Bavaria.
They are incredibly productive on their home turf.
Extremely.
They know the local labor laws, they speak the language, they have 50-year relationships with their local suppliers. They are operating in their absolute comfort zone.
Exactly. Now, the multivariate Pareto distribution essentially asks a probabilistic question. If you take that exact same German corporate structure and ask them to open a brand new manufacturing facility in, say, Vietnam, how likely is it that they will be equally as highly productive in that completely alien environment?
Because suddenly, that German management team has to navigate the legal framework of Ho Chi Minh City. They have to train a workforce that speaks a different language, adapt to different cultural expectations regarding management style, and build an entirely new supply chain from scratch.
Precisely. If the statistical correlation measured by the model is very high, it suggests that great companies are universally great.
Meaning their skills translate anywhere.
It implies their management techniques and technological superiority are easily transferable, and they will succeed anywhere. But if the correlation is low, it means a company might be an absolute powerhouse in its domestic market, but will completely stumble and lose its efficiency when trying to navigate the complex friction of operating in a foreign landscape.
So by deploying this specific mathematical distribution, the economists can simulate the actual probability that a firm from country A will find it mathematically profitable to overcome the friction of setting up a factory in country B just to serve a consumer market in country C.
It transforms chaotic, qualitative human business hurdles into a rigorous, probabilistic map of global production decisions.
It is genuinely incredible how they can take the messy, unpredictable reality of human business decisions, language barriers, legal headaches, supply chain bottlenecks, and translate all of it into a functioning mathematical framework.
It's the beauty of modern quantitative economics.
But a model, no matter how elegant, is ultimately just a theory until you test it against the cold, hard reality of historical data.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the actual testing phase. How do they prove this complex theory accurately maps onto the real world?
They validate the model by stress testing it against massive data sets encompassing trade flows and multinational production statistics from 26 different countries.
26 countries.
Yes. And the primary mechanism they use to verify their theory is a concept known in the field as gravity equations.
Gravity equations. Sounds like something at astrophysics, not a corporate boardroom.
The terminology is borrowed directly from physics, and the underlying logic is remarkably similar.
How so?
In Newtonian physics, we know that the larger two objects are, and the closer they are together in space, the stronger the gravitational pull between them will be. The economic gravity equation applies that exact same logic to global trade. It posits that the larger two national economies are measured by GDP, and the closer they are together geographically, the higher the volume of trade that will flow between them.
Which makes intuitive sense.
It is widely considered one of the most robust, consistently proven empirical findings in all of macroeconomic research. Big economies close together trade a lot. Small economies far apart trade very little.
But the authors of our source material do something incredibly clever here to test their specific theory about multinational production.
They do.
They don't just run one standard gravity equation and call it a day. They run two entirely different variations of it, and they analyze the gap between the results.
This is arguably the most crucial analytical step in the entire paper. They present these findings early on in Table 1, and it sets the stage for everything that follows.
Walk us through Table 1.
First, they run what they define as a restricted gravity equation. This specific equation isolates and looks only at the flow of physical goods happening internally, strictly between a parent company and its own foreign manufacturing affiliates.
Okay, think of a major United States automaker boxing up specialized engines in Michigan and shipping them across the border to their own assembly plant in Mexico.
Perfect example. When the researchers isolate this restricted internal corporate trade, they calculate an incredibly high trade elasticity.
Well, let me pause you there. Trade elasticity essentially measures how sensitive a specific flow of goods is to a change in costs, right?
Exactly.
If trade costs, like shipping fees, fuel prices, or tariffs, go up by 1%, how much does the volume of trade drop? That's the elasticity.
Correct. And the elasticity they found for this internal corporate trade is massive. They estimate it to be somewhere between negative 10.9 and negative 11.6.
What does that mean in plain English?
In economic terms, that means this specific type of trade is hypersensitive. If the cost of moving those engines across the border goes up even a tiny fraction, the volume of internal corporate trade drops off a cliff.
They are incredibly sensitive to any friction.
Yes.
Okay, so multinational networks are highly reactive to costs. What is the second equation they run?
The second is the unrestricted gravity equation. This casts a much wider net. It looks at the overall aggregate flow of all goods between countries, entirely regardless of whether the trade is happening within a multinational network or just between two completely independent companies.
Just total overall trade.
For this broad, unrestricted trade, the elasticity they calculate is significantly lower, ranging roughly from negative 4.3 to negative 8.6.
When you realize that gap exists, everything about modern trade suddenly makes sense.
It's a huge disparity.
The trade happening within a multinational company's own network is drastically more sensitive to costs than general, everyday global trade. But why is that specific mathematical gap the key to proving their whole model?
Because that massive gap provides the empirical proof that the decision to innovate a product and the decision of where to physically produce it are deeply, fundamentally intertwined.
Explain that connection.
If multinational corporate networks are that incredibly sensitive to slight changes in trade costs, it proves they are constantly, actively optimizing that tug-of-war we discussed earlier.
The friction of distance versus the friction of foreign operation.
They are obsessively calculating it. They are not static. They are dynamically shifting their physical production locations across the globe based on where the intellectual property is generated and where the final consumers are located.
They are chasing the absolute lowest friction point in the triangle at all times.
Exactly. And the ultimate vindication for the researchers came when they plugged these newly discovered elasticities back into their complex simulation.
Right, because an economic model is only as good as its predictive power.
Exactly. When they ran the simulation with these parameters, the model successfully accounted for and accurately explained over 90% of the actual observed variation in global bilateral trade flows and multinational production shares across all 26 countries in their dataset.
Over 90% accuracy. That is not just a statistical anomaly or a good guess. That implies they have essentially mapped the underlying DNA of modern globalization.
They really did.
They found the mathematical code that dictates corporate behavior. I mean, the graphs showing this in the paper figures 5 and 6, the model almost perfectly tracks the import, export, and outward MP shares of massive players like the US, Japan, and Germany.
It is stunningly accurate. Now, to be perfectly impartial, the paper does note one area where the model slightly underpredicts.
What's that?
It's a concept called bridging multinational production, or BMP. The model predicts BMP to be about 5.4%, whereas the actual data is closer to 36%.
But even with that slight discrepancy, the overall cross-country distribution patterns align beautifully with reality.
They built an engine that mirrors reality, which then allows them to take this validated model and apply it to answer the most pressing question. Based on these underlying forces, who is actually doing what in the global economy?
Let's get into that, because the paper essentially provides us with a global map of specialization. It gives us the actual roster of who the mathematical forces have designated as the innovators and who has been designated as the producers.
To organize this roster, the authors first had to establish a mathematical baseline, a sort of magic threshold to measure everyone against.
How do they find the baseline?
They calculated what the baseline normal level of innovation would be for a country in a hypothetical world where multinational production simply didn't exist.
The world where every country was forced to physically manufacture every single thing it invented.
Right. Based on the deep calibration of their model, they determined this magic threshold, which they denote as eta to be exactly 16.7%.
So if a country's actual share of innovation, the percentage of its resources dedicated to generating ideas, is above that 16.7% threshold, the model classifies them as a net exporter of ideas.
They are operating as an innovator nation.
And if their share falls below that 16.7% mark, they are categorized as leaning heavily toward being a production hub.
That is the dividing line. And when they run the historical data through this filter in Table 3 of the paper, the resulting roster is illuminating. A very specific group of nations clearly emerges as the global idea factories.
Who made the cut?
The United States, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden all possess innovation shares that sit comfortably and sometimes massively above that threshold.
And on the other side of the ledger, who is below the line?
The model reveals that countries like China, Mexico, Ireland, and Poland fall well below that specific threshold.
So they are the producers.
Despite any domestic innovation they might have, their overall economic posture leans heavily into acting as production hubs. They are fundamentally executing and manufacturing the ideas and blueprints generated elsewhere.
But I want to push back on this a little bit, or rather I want to explore the most mind-bending anomaly the researchers uncovered when they dug deeper into these classifications.
Oh, the U.S. paradox.
Yes, because they didn't just accept the raw numbers at face value. They used their model to run a fascinating simulation to isolate pure inherent ability.
Right.
They essentially asked the model, what if we artificially stripped away the home market effect? What if every single country on Earth had the exact same size population and the exact same consumer purchasing power?
Leveling the playing field completely.
Without the gravitational pull of massive markets, what is each country actually inherently good at? And the results regarding the United States completely shattered my expectations.
It is arguably the most counterintuitive finding in the entire paper. They wanted to isolate raw comparative advantage, pure productivity and efficiency without the distortion of market size. And you are right, the finding is staggering.
Walk me through it.
When they artificially stripped away the massive size of the American consumer market, the mathematical model revealed that the United States actually possesses a strong inherent comparative advantage in physical production, not innovation.
You have to walk me through how the model arrives at that, because the narrative we tell ourselves is so vastly different.
It goes against everything we assume.
We think of the United States as the undisputed heavyweight champion of ideas. We think of Silicon Valley software, MIT robotics, Wall Street financial engineering.
Yes.
Are you telling me the mathematical data suggests the country that birthed the iPhone is inherently, fundamentally better suited to be running giant assembly lines? How does the model account for the massive American university system or tech infrastructure to make a claim like that?
It is a vital question. The model isn't saying the U.S. is bad at innovation. It is saying that when you look strictly at the raw underlying parameters of physical manufacturing efficiency, the infrastructure, the logistics networks, the availability of capital, the raw output per worker in a physical setting, the U.S. is actually exceptionally globally dominant at production.
Wow.
In a purely frictionless vacuum where market size didn't matter, the U.S. would be highly efficient at functioning as the world's factory. But, and this is the entire crux of the theory, we do not live in a frictionless vacuum.
We live in a world with massive gravity.
This finding is the ultimate proof of why the home market effect is the dominant force in the global economy. It is so overwhelmingly powerful that it completely overrides raw underlying comparative advantage.
Because the American consumer market is simply too colossal to ignore.
Exactly. The United States exhibits a massive innovation share, modeled at an R value of 0.182. Why? Because the purchasing power of the United States domestic market is so unimaginably enormous that it effortlessly absorbs those massive fixed upfront costs of research and development we talked about earlier.
The billion-dollar first unit costs.
Right. If an American tech company spends $2 billion developing a new virtual reality headset, they don't have to worry about the friction of international borders to recoup their money. They have hundreds of millions of relatively wealthy consumers sitting right in their backyard.
The economic gravity of that massive consumer base is so incredibly strong that it forcibly sucks all the domestic capital and talent away from physical manufacturing and redirects it into innovation.
The U.S. is essentially forced by the sheer, undeniable gravity of its own wealth to be an idea factory. It is simply too big not to invent things.
That reframes the entire American economy. We are innovators not necessarily because it is our purest inherent skill, but because our market size demands we take the high-margin cognitive roles in the global supply chain.
It's a structural mandate.
And the paper highlights a fascinating, perfect mirror image of this paradox by looking at smaller countries like Hungary and Ireland, right?
Yes, the contrast provides a beautiful, symmetrical illustration of how these forces operate on smaller economies. When the researchers stripped away market size for Ireland, they found the exact opposite of the American paradox.
Which is?
In a vacuum, small countries like Ireland actually possess a very strong inherent comparative advantage in innovation.
Which makes sense historically. The Celtic Tiger era was built on a highly educated, English-speaking workforce and a strong tech sector.
Precisely. They have the universities, the talent, and the environment for massive idea generation. But because their domestic population is relatively small, they suffer from a severe negative home market effect.
Their gravitational pull is just too weak to sustain the high fixed costs of R&D on their own.
Exactly. If an Irish firm invents a billion-dollar product, they cannot possibly recoup those costs selling only to the Irish population. They immediately have to navigate international friction to survive.
They have to cross borders instantly.
This lack of a massive domestic market to absorb R&D costs forcefully pushes their economy away from its inherent strength in domestic innovation and pulls it toward becoming a highly efficient, high-tech production hub for foreign multinationals who are looking for a foothold in Europe.
The global forces dictate that they end up manufacturing the pharmaceutical drugs and software physical infrastructure that were designed in the larger markets.
It is a relentless game of global musical chairs dictated entirely by the invisible gravity of market size.
But we need to move from the theory to the actual payoff. Because the ultimate pressing question for anyone listening to this, whether they are a factory worker, an engineer, or a local business owner, is simply, is this complex, highly separated global system actually good for us?
That is the ultimate question.
Are we collectively better off participating in this massive web of multinational production than we would be if every country just closed its borders and manufactured its own goods?
To answer that critical question, the authors dedicate a major portion of the paper to analyzing welfare, openness, and the complex flow of profits.
Where do they break this down?
They present their findings in Table 5 of the study, which meticulously outlines the gains from openness. And the top-line aggregate news is overwhelmingly positive.
What are the numbers?
According to the rigorous calculations of the model, on average, across the 26 countries in their massive data set, participating in this modern, highly separated, globalized system results in a 24.6% boost in real income compared to a hypothetical world of total economic isolation.
A 24.6% boost in real purchasing power across the board. That is not a marginal rounding error. That is a massive, life-altering dividend generated simply by allowing the global supply chain to optimize itself.
It is massive.
But as with all massive macroeconomic shifts, the devil is absolutely in the distribution. Averages can hide a lot of localized pain.
They always do.
How do those massive gains actually get distributed between the idea factories and the production hubs?
That is where the analysis gets deeply nuanced. The authors break down the mathematical formula for these aggregate gains into two distinct separate mechanisms: the direct effect and the indirect effect.
Let's walk through those carefully. The direct effect seems relatively intuitive, right? This is the benefit we all feel when we walk into a big box store.
Yes, the direct effect is the straightforward, immediate benefit of having access to a vastly wider variety of significantly cheaper, higher quality goods.
Because the physical production of a smartphone or a television is now taking place wherever on Earth it is absolutely most efficient to assemble it.
Exactly. The retail prices of those items plummet, and the variety of choices expands. Your local currency simply goes much further at the checkout counter. The model shows that virtually every single country that participates in the global trade network receives a massive positive direct effect. We all get cheaper laptops and more affordable clothing.
That makes perfect sense. But the indirect effect is where the political controversy and the friction really lie.
It absolutely is. The indirect effect is entirely concerned with the international flow of corporate profits.
Wow.
Remember the global triangle we discussed earlier? Revenue flows from the consumer destination through the physical production location and ultimately pulls back at the origin of the initial idea.
Right.
This dynamic means that the innovator countries, the massive idea factories like the United States and Germany, receive a massive positive indirect effect.
Because the profits flow home to them.
A literal global river of corporate profits washes back onto their shores, enriching the domestic economy above and beyond the fact that they also get to buy cheap goods. They win on both fronts.
And what happens to the countries on the other side of the triangle? The production hubs.
The production hubs experience a very different reality. Let's look back at Ireland as the prime example, because Ireland acts as a massive, highly efficient production hub for global tech and pharmaceutical giants. The model shows they receive an almost unbelievably huge direct benefit from participating in globalization.
What's the number?
The data indicates a mind-blowing 118% boost in welfare simply from the direct effect of integrating their economy.
118%.
However, they simultaneously suffer a negative indirect effect of roughly 13%.
Because the profits generated by the physical labor occurring inside the factories in Ireland don't stay in Ireland. They are ultimately repatriated and flow back to the corporate headquarters in California or Frankfurt.
Precisely. They are still massively, undeniably better off overall. The 118% gain completely dwarfs the 13% loss. But the underlying dynamic is that they are constantly bleeding a portion of the value they generate back to the idea factories.
Now, a really interesting theoretical question arises here. If both traditional trade shipping goods and multinational production building factories abroad generate these massive gains, why don't we just relentlessly pursue maximum expansion of both simultaneously?
It seems like the logical policy.
Can we just keep adding more trade agreements on top of MP networks to get exponentially richer?
You would think so, but the model reveals a fascinating limitation. It mathematically demonstrates that traditional trade and multinational production are actually, to a large extent, substitutes for one another.
Substitutes.
Yes.
Not multipliers.
Right. They are not perfectly additive. Think of the logic this way. If a multinational corporation has already gone through the immense effort and cost of building a massive network of foreign factories to produce goods locally within their target markets, they have essentially already solved the friction problem.
The factories are already there.
Opening up the shipping lanes to allow them to send more goods from their home country doesn't really provide much additional benefit. They're already fulfilling the demand locally.
It's like a city building two massive parallel subway systems that go to the exact same stops. Having the first one fundamentally changes the economy of the city. Building a second one right next to it offers drastically diminishing marginal returns.
That is a perfect analogy. Because of these complex substitutable interactions, the model points out a deeply fascinating, almost counterintuitive anomaly. It identifies the existence of actual losers.
Losers from globalization.
While the average global gain from openness is nearly 25%, the math shows that under certain, very specific conditions, some countries can actually suffer tiny incremental losses in overall welfare from pure multinational production liberalization.
Wait, a country can genuinely lose wealth by allowing foreign companies to build factories inside their borders. How does the model explain that happening?
The paper points specifically to Turkey as an example in their counterfactual simulations. Now, it is important to note the projected losses are incredibly tiny, a fraction of a single percent. But the underlying economic mechanism causing it is vital to understand.
Walk us through the mechanism.
When the barriers to multinational production drop globally, it can trigger a sudden, aggressive reallocation of resources within a specific country. If foreign multinationals rush into Turkey to build assembly plants, the domestic economy might suddenly pull its own highly educated workers and engineers out of their nascent domestic innovation sector to go manage or work in these massive foreign-owned factories.
Because the foreign companies can offer higher immediate salaries.
Yes. But if the home market effect is simultaneously working against Turkey on the global stage, this internal shift can cause a severe misallocation of their domestic resources.
They abandon their own intellectual property development.
They abandon it to become a branch plant economy. In the long run, this can lead to a subtle deterioration in their international terms of trade that very slightly outweighs the direct, immediate benefits of having access to cheaper consumer goods.
That is a profound insight. It proves mathematically that globalization is not simply a rising tide that perfectly and equally lifts all boats at all times. There are incredibly complex, sometimes destructive currents flowing underneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Which brings us directly to what is undoubtedly the most controversial, emotionally charged topic in this entire discussion: the fate of the workers.
Yes, this is the issue that dominates headlines and elections.
I'm going to directly address the assumption that almost everyone listening to this, and frankly, the assumption I held before reading this research, likely brought into this deep dive.
What's the assumption?
The common narrative goes exactly like this. If a wealthy, massive economy like the United States relentlessly specializes in cognitive innovation and systematically ships all of its actual physical manufacturing jobs overseas to places like China or Mexico, the blue-collar production workers who are left behind in the United States must be financially devastated.
That is the accepted story.
The narrative says their factories close down, they lose their livelihoods, and they are permanently forced into significantly lower-paying, insecure service sector jobs.
Right. It is an entirely logical assumption based on the immediate visible pain of a factory closing in a specific town. It is what we see on the local news.
But what do the data say?
The rigorous mathematical modeling in this paper reveals a deeply counterintuitive truth that is arguably the most startling, provocative conclusion of the entire study. The data shows that even in the specific countries that hyper-specialize in innovation and offshore their manufacturing, the overall real wages of production workers usually go UP.
Let me make absolutely certain I am interpreting this correctly. You saying the economists mathematically proved that when a wealthy nation aggressively exports its factory jobs to cheaper labor markets, the standard of living for the factory workers who remain in that wealthy nation actually increases.
Yes.
How on earth does the macroeconomic mechanism for that actually function? It sounds contradictory.
To understand the mechanics of it, we have to strictly separate the concept of nominal wages from real wages.
Okay, nominal wage is just the literal number printed on your paycheck. Real wage is the actual purchasing power of that paycheck.
Yeah.
How much physical stuff that money can actually buy at the grocery store or the car dealership.
Exactly. The mathematical model openly acknowledges the painful part of the narrative. Yes, when multinational production liberalization accelerates, there is absolutely, undeniably downward pressure on the nominal paychecks of production workers in rich countries.
Because they are now effectively competing in a global labor pool against significantly lower wage workers in developing nations.
Exactly. Their actual dollar amount wages might stagnate for years, or in some specific sectors, even fall slightly.
So the pain on the paycheck side is mathematically real. The model doesn't deny the localized friction.
It does not. But UT, and this is the massive overriding macroeconomic but, that same aggressive MP liberalization causes the global prices of everyday consumer goods to absolutely plummet.
The price index drop.
The overall aggregate price index of the economy drops dramatically because virtually everything, clothing, electronics, appliances, automobiles, is now being relentlessly manufactured in the most hyper-efficient, lowest-cost locations globally.
Everything gets cheaper.
Because the cost of living falls so sharply and so broadly across the entire economy, the production worker's stagnant paycheck suddenly goes incredibly much further at the store.
Their money buys more.
The massive drop in the cost of consumer goods mathematically outpaces the downward pressure on their nominal wage. Therefore, their real standard of living, their true purchasing power, actually rises.
That is a staggering finding to wrap your head around. It suggests that the tidal wave of hyper-cheap consumer goods generated by globalization actually rescues and elevates the blue-collar workers' overall standard of living, even as their specific sector faces brutal, relentless global competition.
According to the parameters of the mathematical model, yes, and it serves as a vital, necessary reminder of why economists insist on looking at the entire macroeconomic picture, rather than focusing solely on one isolated, albeit highly visible, metric like domestic factory employment. The unseen benefits of cheaper goods outweigh the seen losses in nominal wages.
But the global economy is a closed system in many ways. If the production workers in the rich, innovating countries are not actually the ultimate mathematical losers of globalization, who takes the hit?
Sure.
Who is the demographic that genuinely loses purchasing power in this massive geographic separation?
The model points the finger at a highly unexpected, rarely discussed demographic: the innovation workers residing in the countries that get forcefully designated as production hubs.
Wait, really? You are talking about the scientists, the software engineers, and the researchers living in the smaller or developing economies.
Yes. To understand why, we have to look back at the home market effect. Imagine you are an innovation worker, a brilliant product designer living in a mid-sized economy that has just been deeply integrated into the global supply chain.
Okay.
Suddenly, your country is flooded with massive, highly efficient foreign multinational factories looking for cheap assembly labor. The macroeconomic forces dictate that your country must violently reallocate its labor force to meet this new demand. It doubles down entirely on physical production.
So what happens to the domestic innovation sector?
It begins to shrink and wither, because local firms simply cannot compete with the massive multi-billion-dollar R&D budgets of the idea factories located in the United States or Germany.
Because the domestic sector shrinks, the demand for high-end cognitive skills in that country evaporates.
Precisely. As the demand for your specific high-level research skills drops locally, your nominal wages take a massive hit. And unlike the factory worker in the US, the drop in consumer prices from globalization is not enough to offset the severe collapse of your specific labor market.
Wow.
You are the demographic that mathematically loses out when your entire nation gets designated by economic gravity as the world's factory floor.
That completely, utterly flips the traditional narrative on its head. The blue-collar assembly worker in the wealthy idea factory actually gains long-term purchasing power, while the highly educated white-collar researcher trapped in the emerging production hub loses their economic leverage.
That's what the data shows.
That hidden dynamic right there is exactly why we do these deep dives into the source material. The data always reveals a more complex truth than the political slogans.
And what makes this research so compelling is that the authors don't just stop at analyzing historical data to explain the past. They actually utilize their validated mathematical engine to run future simulations.
Let's look forward.
They construct elaborate counterfactual scenarios to see what mathematically happens if we start tweaking the fundamental dials of the global economy.
Let's dig into those simulations. Let's play God with the macroeconomic variables for a minute. What exactly is the first simulation they run?
Simulation 1 looks at a very practical, plausible scenario. What happens to the global distribution of wealth and labor if the friction of multinational production, that specific gamma variable measuring the difficulty of operating abroad, simply drops by 5% universally across the board?
So imagine a scenario where international commercial law becomes slightly more standardized globally, or AI translation software advances to the point where managing a team of engineers in a foreign country becomes 5% easier and cheaper. What does Table 6 in the paper tell us happens next?
The model predicts that the entire world immediately, almost violently, reorders itself to become even more hyper-specialized. The geographic separation accelerates.
It gets even more extreme.
Innovation concentrates even harder and faster in the specific locations that already possess a strong inherent comparative advantage or a massive home market effect.
Give me an example from the simulation.
The simulation shows the Benelux region, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, which are highly integrated advanced economies, seeing their share of global innovation jump by nearly 10%, actually over 10% in some metrics.
Just from a 5% drop in friction.
Yes. Conversely, a country like Australia, which is a wealthy but geographically isolated market, sees its share of global innovation plummet by over 11%, as the mathematical forces push it further into alternative economic roles.
So making it just slightly easier to manage a multinational supply chain causes a massive reshuffling of who invents what. But what happens to overall global wealth in that scenario?
The aggregate outcome is highly positive. Overall global spending power, the true measure of global welfare, rises by nearly 2%, specifically 1.93%.
So making the system 5% smoother makes everyone collectively almost 2% richer, but it radically permanently shifts the geographic location of the high-end jobs.
It is a massive disruption for a net gain. But Simulation 2 is the one that really caught my eye because it isn't really a hypothetical. It is an attempt to model the single most defining economic event of our generation.
They attempt to model the rise of the East.
Yes. The researchers specifically utilized their model to simulate the integration of China's massive labor force into the broader world economy. They wanted to see the mathematical ripple effects of fully connecting a billion-person workforce to the established global idea factories.
And what does the data in Table 7 reveal about this integration?
It perfectly outlines the mechanics of what we can colloquially call the Apple model.
The Apple model.
When the simulation introduces a massive, efficient labor market like China into the system, it creates an unprecedented win-win efficiency shock for the wealthy countries positioned to take advantage of it.
How did that play out?
The model clearly shows that in response to China's integration, nations like the United States and Japan aggressively doubled down on their roles as idea factories. They rapidly shifted their domestic capital and educational resources away from physical manufacturing and overwhelmingly into software design, advanced engineering, and R&D.
And they utilized China as their massive, hyper-efficient, scalable manufacturing hub.
Exactly. The ultimate manifestation of the great geographic separation. They conceptualize and design the iPhone in the labs of Cupertino, California, and they execute the physical assembly in the massive factory cities of Shenzhen, China. It is the perfect, real-world validation of the mathematical model.
It is. And the model's calculation regarding the wage impacts of this specific historical integration is deeply fascinating, particularly in light of our earlier discussion.
What did the wage numbers show?
In this specific scenario, the sudden integration of China caused the real wages of United States production workers to rise by a mathematically verified 0.16%.
A 0.16% increase in real purchasing power for the American factory worker. It is an incredibly small incremental gain, but crucially, it is still a mathematical gain.
Driven entirely by the sudden, massive influx of cheaper Chinese-assembled goods, lowering the American cost of living.
Exactly. But here is the critical comparison. While the American production worker saw a 0.16% boost, the American innovation worker, the software engineer or the executive, saw a massive, disproportionate 0.98% boost in their real wages, resulting from that exact same integration.
Almost a full percentage point boost for the white-collar inventor, and just a tiny fraction of percent for the blue-collar factory worker. So the mathematical reality is that everyone in the United States technically won from the integration of China, but the cognitive workers at the top won by a factor of roughly 6 to 1.
The overall economic pie gets significantly larger, but the distribution of those new slices is wildly fundamentally unequal.
You have precisely identified the underlying mechanical tension driving so much of our current socioeconomic reality. The system generates massive aggregate wealth, but the internal distribution of that wealth heavily favors the specific demographic engaged in cognitive innovation.
And just to push the boundaries of their theory, the authors take the simulation one step further into the absolute extreme. They run what they call a frictionless scenario.
What exactly happens in this ultimate hypothetical world?
The researchers asked the mathematical engine, what if multinational production between the United States and China possessed absolutely zero friction?
Zero friction.
What if the variable gamma was exactly 1, meaning it was literally just as easy, cheap, and legally simple for an American CEO to manage a factory floor in Shenzhen as it is to manage one in Ohio?
A world with zero tariffs, perfect translation, identical legal systems, and instantaneous logistics.
A theoretical utopia of trade. Under that extreme, frictionless scenario, the model predicts that the United States' rate of innovation would absolutely skyrocket by an astonishing 21.87%.
Over 21%.
The United States would transform into an unprecedented, hyper-focused engine of pure invention, happily pushing almost the entirety of its physical production demands onto the Chinese labor market.
And because the global efficiency gains from this perfect specialization would be so astronomically high, it would lead to massive double-digit increases in real spending power for the populations of both nations.
It is a theoretical exercise, but it beautifully illustrates the absolute mathematical limit and potential of the great geographical separation.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered a truly monumental amount of intellectual ground today, and we need to synthesize this massive journey.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. If you look at your own grocery bill or the devices sitting on your desk, the story of how they got there is infinitely more complex than we usually acknowledge. What we have learned from unpacking this incredible piece of economic research is that modern globalization is no longer just about shipping boxes of finished goods across oceans.
It is fundamentally about shipping ideas.
We live in a heavily structured world where the home market effect, the sheer undeniable gravity of massive consumer wealth, turns huge economies like the United States into inescapable black holes for innovation, forcibly designating them as the world's idea factories.
regardless of traditional comparative advantage.
And perhaps most surprisingly, the rigorous mathematical modeling demonstrates that the traditional blue-collar workers residing within those idea factories actually derive a mathematical benefit from this geographic separation.
The resulting explosion in global manufacturing efficiency drives down the cost of their daily lives faster than it suppresses their wages.
The political narratives are simple, but the mathematical reality of the global economy is deeply, beautifully complex.
It is an incredibly elegant framework that genuinely helps clarify the chaotic economic history of the last 30 years. But as we do with every exploration of source material, we want to leave the audience with a final, provocative thought to mull over.
Something to think about after the show ends.
A concept that builds on the foundation of this research, but forces us to look toward the horizon of what comes next.
I am ready. Where does this mathematical logic take us in the future?
If the era of multinational production defined the last few decades by aggressively, systematically separating the intellectual idea from the physical factory,
Yeah.
what happens to this entire mathematical model when the underlying technological infrastructure fundamentally changes?
What kind of changes?
Well, right now we are witnessing the rapid exponential rise of artificial intelligence systems that are becoming capable of autonomously generating highly complex research and development.
The ideas are getting cheaper to generate.
Simultaneously, the relentless advancement of 3D printing and localized automated manufacturing threatens to essentially move the physical factory directly into the consumer's living room or local neighborhood.
Bringing the production back home.
Are we currently standing on the precipice of the complete and total collapse of this great geographical separation? If the idea is generated instantly by an AI residing in a decentralized cloud, and the factory is a sophisticated printer sitting on your desk, the entire dynamic of the global triangle simply vanishes.
The friction of distance and the friction of foreign production both drop to zero.
Who actually captures the value and wins the economic game of the future when the fundamental separation of thoughts and things ceases to exist?
The complete collapse of the global triangle. The idea that the very geographic separation that defines our current era might just be a temporary technological stepping stone. That is a deeply profound concept to grapple with.
It certainly changes the math.
Thank you so much for joining us on this expansive deep dive into the source material. We truly